Today we're going to talk about another way that we can respond to books that we read in reading. So I know we maybe talked about this one time, but has anyone ever heard of a text to self connection? Text to self connection. Does anyone think they know what that is and maybe they could explain it to the class? Eliza?
Well, a text to self connection is when you're reading, like you see or listening, if like if you eat this breakfast, and then you're not going to eat the same breakfast, it's a text to self connection.
Okay, great. Would anyone like to add on to what Eliza said? Samantha?
Well, it's like something in the book that reminds you of something that happened to you.
Excellent. So something from a book that reminds you of something that happened to yourself. Okay. Does anybody else want to add on anything to what Samantha said? Dale?
Maybe it's like the character makes a mistake in the book, and then you make that same mistake.
So it maybe reminds you of that time that happened to you. Excellent. Amanda, one more?
Like it's something like it reminds you like you.
Yes, something that the character did that reminds you of something that maybe happened to you or something that you do too. So I have an example from Ray Jakes is a Rock Star, now that we're a few chapters in. So on page 31, when Ray is being really sneaky and he goes and takes the rocks from his dad's rock collection without asking his mom or dad, and then he brings them into school and he doesn't tell them and he doesn't have permission from them to do that. That reminds me of one time I had this really cool new stuffed animal when I was younger, and I really wanted to bring it into school to show all my friends and my classmates and my teachers, and my parents said, no, you cannot bring in your brand new stuffed animal. You don't need a stuffed animal at school, but I snuck it into my backpack and brought it in anyway. So when I read this part about Ray sneaking around in his house, it reminded me of the time I did a very similar thing, and which I wasn't supposed to do. So that is my example of a text to self connection. So there's also another kind of connection that we've spoken about before that's called text to text. Does anybody think they can come up with an example or explain to the class what it means when you make a text-to-text connection? Thomas?
Maybe like when you read another book, and then you read a different book in a different series, and then they're kind of like the characters are kind of like the same thing.
Excellent. Thumbs up if you agree with what Thomas said. Awesome. Would anyone like to add on? Georgia?
Like it's like basically the same thing as text to self, but instead of like comparing it to yourself, like you compare it to another book.
Excellent. So maybe a character reminds you of a different character in another book? Or maybe something, an event, or something surprising that happens in a book reminds you of another event or something that happens in a different book? Ria?
Maybe like the characters used to is acting like one of the books. Like maybe like she's acting like sneaky in one book and then sneaky in another book.
Can you think of an example from maybe a book that you've read? It doesn't have to be sneaky. Okay, you want to think about it? Dale, do you have an example?
So I'm reading Clementine, and Clementine reminds me of her name like a berry because like when people say Clementine, pay attention, she's paying attention, but to other things that seem interesting to her, not like the basic things like paying attention to her teachers.
Excellent. So now I want to show you some sentence starters that we can use when we either respond to our partners or when we respond maybe in writing on a Post-it in our reading notebook. So strong readers make connections. So if you want to make a text-to-self connection, you can say, this is like my life because. Or you can say, this character reminds me of myself because. So my example with Elray, I could say, this character, or Elray Jakes, reminds me of myself because when he snuck into his dad's office and got his rocks and brought them into school, one time I did a very similar thing and I snuck in my stuffed animal and brought that into school also. For text-to-text, you could say this character is like a character in the book and then give the title. So I also think Elray Jakes reminds me a little bit of Jake Drake because they both kind of have problems in school with bullies. So Elray Jakes gets bullied sometimes and talks about it, and we learn all about his problems. And a very similar situation happens with Jake Drake at his school. So you can also write about that. Or you can say, this reminds me of, so I could say, Elray Jakes is a rock star reminds me of Jake Drake Bully Buster, because in both books, the characters get bullied by a peer at school. So what I want you to do now is turn and talk with the person next to you and see if you can think of a time where you can make a text-to-self connection or a text-to-text connection in your books that you are reading. So think about something that maybe something you're reading relates to yourself, or maybe it reminds you of a different book. Okay, so go do that now.